Right, God is good, and thank Him for allowing us to start yet another letter or book of the Bible. This time, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, or the one that we call his first letter to the Corinthians, First Corinthians. And I want to look at it through the lens, maybe the entire book through the lens of consider your calling, a phrase that's going to come up in this first chapter, but I think it's going to sum up a lot of what's going on in the entire book that I think breaks down into three sections, possibly just two, but understanding that it seems that Paul is responding to a list of questions from the church at Corinth. He's not going to start there. He's going to pick that up about chapter 7. But for the first 6 chapters, he's going to do what we called in the past, talk about their actual counseling issue. If you look at it from the perspective of a counselor who has someone come into their office and they ask them what's going on. Well, sometimes counselors will say the thing that they first tell you is the presenting issue. Even if they are completely candid with you, it's the thing that they think might be the reason why they're seeking counseling. But on the other hand, sometimes it's just what they're comfortable talking about. And so to get beneath the presenting issue to the counseling issue, sometimes it takes time. And so here, Paul, being at least somewhat familiar with the group, he is going to start with the counseling issue, what he believes is really going on beneath the questions that they are asking. And so he's going to deal with that counseling issue in the first 6 verses, whereas by the time we get to first 6 chapters, and by the time we get to chapter 7, he is going to pick up with the questions that they have posed, what I will call the presenting issue. And that might really carry us through the conclusion of the book of First Corinthians, but I'm going to suggest that maybe it only carries us through chapter 11, because towards the end of chapter 11, he is going to make a statement about the other things. He will deal with those things when he gets there. It doesn't specifically say what he's dealing with, but it sounds like the remaining questions that they might have asked. However, it's not the last set of questions he's going to deal with. The others might be him going back to what I'll call the counseling issue, because again, he is going to turn his attention to a set of questions in chapters 12 through 13. He's going to go back through their spiritual gifts and how they have it a little bit misunderstood, the value of the gifts that they have. And then in chapter 14, he's going to talk more about the spiritual gifts, but the way that they have lost touch with the purpose or the reason why they've been given the gifts in the first place, as distinguished from the value in having the gifts. And then he's going to talk about the resurrection in chapter 15 before closing out in chapter 16, talking about collection for the saints, I think the saints in Jerusalem. But taking it slow, let's just look at chapter 1 and look at it from the perspective of not only that whole concept of consider your calling, but the way in which he is redirecting their attention to their calling, because in losing track of their calling, they have begun to think of themselves as better than fill in the blank. And through that first 6 chapters, through those first 6 chapters, I think he's going to hit a different set of things that they are having trouble with, thinking that they might have risen above in a time when they really need to consider their calling and realize whether or not they've really progressed as far as they have thought. But with that, the first 3 verses of chapter 1 are going to be a greeting. He's going to pretty much greet every church that he writes a letter to in a unique way, and the Corinthians are going to get their unique greeting, because in verses 4 through 8, he's going to give thanks for them. As in verses 10 through roughly 17, he's going to then shift his thanks to an appeal to them. As in verses 18 through 25, roughly, he's then going to shift his focus to himself, or what the ministers or apostles of Christ are preaching. He's literally going to say in verse 22, as in verses 26 through the end of the chapter, he is then going to make that appeal, as we have titled it, to consider your calling. And taking it a little bit more slowly, in verses 1 through 3, where he is making the greeting. It's a pretty standard greeting. The difference is he is going to simply give thanks for the grace that they have been given, as opposed to the way that he greeted the Romans, thanking God for their obedience. Noticeably absent is any talk about the obedience of the Corinthians, because of some things that he's going to get to before too long. But in giving thanks because of the grace that they have been given in verse 4, verses 4 through 9 are then going to shift toward a conversation of not only the grace that they've been given, but the gifts that they have been given, because they are exceeding in the ability to speak and to have knowledge. And they're not lacking in any spiritual gift, he's going to say, but that's going to get them into a little bit of trouble, as we see in verses 10 through 17, because then he is going to appeal in verse 10 that there be no divisions. And the problem is going to be, as he's going to get to in later chapters, by the time we see in chapter 12, there are different types of gifts. And what is happening is, because they are each gifted in individual ways, they're struggling to figure out, well, who's better? The one who speaks in tongues, or the one who prophesies, the one who does the various things that God has given them the ability to do. And the problem is, it's caused divisions, as opposed to allowing them to realize that each of those different gifts allows them, if they work together, to make progress together that they will never make individually, no matter how gifted they are. It's something we've seen before, but it's going to be more of a focus to what he writes to the church at Corinth. And so one of the problems that is happening is, in addition to their giftedness, going back to verse 5, their knowledge is causing them to be puffed up against one another in terms of their wisdom. But the wisdom that they are flexing, Paul is going to distinguish in verses 18 through 25 from the wisdom of God. And so he's saying, basically, anytime you have a wisdom that causes rivalry, that is not the kind of wisdom that actually comes from the Father. And so he's going to say, consider what we preached in verse 22 in that section. They simply preached Christ crucified, and that is the wisdom of God. Not so much redundantly saying over and over, Christ died, was buried, and was resurrected, and he's coming back. But understanding the depth of that story is the wisdom of God. What happened here seems to be that in pursuing the wisdom of the ages, he's going to say they're basically a blend of cultures, and he's highlighting the difference between the Hebrews and the Greeks. The Hebrews want signs. The Greeks, they're looking for some clever phrasing. Going back to his time before the Areopagus in the Acts, he had to adjust his approach to them. But it seems that, as I heard an older, wiser statesman, I'll call him, illustrate one time. I think I've used this illustration before, but indulge me. It's like a young lady who fell out of bed, and her parents rushed into the room hearing the thud on the floor. And when they asked her what happened, clearly seeing that she fell out of bed, she's going to say, I guess I stayed too close to where I got in. And so that's what seems to be the problem at Corinth. To the degree they have those who have fallen under the influence of the wisdom of the culture that they grew up in, it seems that they have not moved far enough away from wanting to hear clever phrasings or clever argumentation into understanding where the true wisdom of God rests. It's leaving behind the clever phrasings of the day, or the wisdom of the day, to have a deeper understanding of the significance of Christ's death, his burial, and his resurrection. Why did he even choose to give up privilege in the first place, to come and come and be around us, only to basically have us be the reason why he had to suffer in the first place? That's the wisdom of God, getting a deeper understanding of the why and the how and everything else that goes along with his presence here, essentially getting a better understanding of the gospel. And we're going to see through the rest of the book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, is the way in which all these questions that they are later going to present to Paul for answers, and also some he's going to raise for them. He's going to say, I've also heard that these things are going on, and you need to consider these things too. If they were really maturing in the wisdom of God and the role that Christ played in his plan of reconciliation between him and us, then a lot of these questions they'd already have the answer to. But because they became so preoccupied with the wisdom of the times, or the style of argumentation of the times, they weren't fully maturing, as he's going to say later on, to those for whom he could present meat as opposed to milk. Anyway, misphrased it, but it's a familiar metaphor that we'll see picked up in the book of Hebrews as well, which is one of the reasons why some think that Paul wrote Hebrews as well, even though the author is not specified. It's because he's going to talk to different groups about the degree to which, no matter how thankful he is for them, they need to develop the ability to have a deeper understanding of the deeper wisdom of God, while they're spending time on other things that aren't quite as important, no matter how clever or wise or impressive they might seem. And so, just as Paul repeatedly encourages the Roman church to basically hold tight to their understanding or their sense of purpose, understanding that over and over again, he called them to attention or to recognize his purpose as an apostle, first and foremost, was to be a servant. Likewise, Christ was a servant and they were to be servants. A distinction that he seems to draw in subtle ways in his letter to the church at Corinth is, apart from purpose, it's also important to understand our calling, because no matter what their understanding is of their purpose, the fact that they've been extremely gifted is causing them to develop their gifts in a way that's still leaving them shallow and not really progressing and understanding the depth of Christ and God that their gifts really should be empowering them to, if they remembered their calling, that God didn't call them because they were clever or powerful or influential by the world's standards, but he used them in their humble estate to gift them in ways that would humble the proud. The problem is, in losing touch with the humility of their calling, they're now becoming the proud. Something that Paul will address as we move forward, God willing, in 1 Corinthians chapter